Okay, good afternoon, everyone. And thank you for attending the Gaza Round Table. My name is Dr. Mark Selleck. I am a professor of political science and also co-advisor for the Political Science Student Association. Speaking of which, I'd like to begin by thanking the members of the Political Science Student Association for hosting this event. So please join me in offering them a round of applause. Now, before I introduce our panelists, I'd like to explain the format for today and lay some ground rules for the event. Our panelists will give roughly 10 to 15 minutes each of exposition on the history of and politics connected to the current events. After they've finished, I'll read 5 questions that have been posed by the Political Science Student Association, and we will then open the floor for questions from the audience. I ask that before we begin, that everyone turn off all electronic devices or place them on silent and stow them. The event is being videotaped, so please refrain from taking pictures and video of the event. I also ask that the panelists be allowed to offer their remarks and field questions without interruption. If you have a question for one or both panelists during the question and answer session, please direct your question to the appropriate person or persons and limit your time to asking a clear question. Please do not offer speeches or questions with complicated preambles. And we expect all participants to follow the appropriate decorum for an event such as this one. Thank you in advance. It's now my pleasure to introduce our 2 panelists. Dr. Daniel Borses is an associate professor of history at Riverside City College. He has a PhD in history from the University of California at Irvine with a focus on Asian American history and Asian American studies, and a minor emphasis in Middle Eastern history. His dissertation is entitled Constructing a Filipino-American Cold War Social Imaginary, 1945 to 1965. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Borses. Our second panelist today is Dr. Dariush Haghighat. Dr. Haghighat is a professor of political science at Riverside City College and is the founder of the Riverside Community College District's award-winning Model United Nations program. Dr. Haghighat earned his PhD from the University of California at Riverside with a focus on international relations, Middle Eastern politics, and American foreign policy. His dissertation was entitled Interpreting U.S. Policy Toward Iran During the Early Cold War Years. Dr. Haghighat also gave the 60th Distinguished Faculty Lecture, which was entitled Iran and America, A Troubled Past, A Turbulent Present. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Haghighat. Okay, and without any further ado, I would like to turn the floor over to Dr. Borses.
Good afternoon. To start us off, I just want to make one point, mainly in reaction to a lot of the social media coverage of this event, that this event is a tragedy, and it's not an event that is at all black or white morally. Palestinians and Israelis are suffering, the Palestinian diaspora is suffering, the Jewish diaspora is suffering as well. And so I definitely want to make this point here as we go through this presentation, that our groups are not monolithic, right? That Prime Minister Netanyahu does not represent all of Israel. There are numerous views within Israel itself. He does not represent all Jews, especially, and likewise, Hamas does not represent all Palestinians, either in the territories or abroad throughout the world. And that's one of the points I want to emphasize as we go, that this is a complex situation with a great deal of nuance. That said, let's go ahead and look at some of the historical background of this event. And I want to talk briefly about why there are Jews in the Middle East. And well, they've been there for a long time, not all of them, but the current conflict really began when 2 people tried to occupy the same land. And the great number of Jews came from a specific region in Eastern and Central Europe. They were part of the Jewish diaspora. Diaspora means that they have been spread out throughout the world, mainly since the Romans had dispersed them from Jerusalem in the 3rd century. Now, life was pretty tough for Jews in Central and in Eastern Europe. In a lot of Central Europe, Jews were only allowed to live in cities and not in the countryside for fear they might poison the wells. In parts of Russia, Jews were only allowed to live in the countryside and not in the city. The largest number of Jews who would eventually perform what is known as Aliyah, stepping up into Palestine, were Ashkenazi Jews from Eastern and Central Europe. But there were allies, particularly Theodor Herzl, who is often named as one of the most important intellectuals behind the movement to Palestine. He was a German Jew, spoke German perfectly assimilated, yet still experienced anti-Semitism. And that is, of course, a difficult word because the Arabs we're going to talk about are also Semites, but we can address that later. But his book, The Jewish State, written in 1896, proposed that the solution for the problem of Jews in Europe was to return to their ancient homeland in Palestine. Palestine was a Roman province that had become a Byzantine province and eventually a province of the Ottoman Empire. It had been controlled mainly by Turkish people for hundreds of years. But again, at the time he was writing, the bulk of Jews in Europe lived in a small segment of the Russian Empire called the Pale of Settlement. The Pale of Settlement, sometimes remembered fondly, but again, this is a result of Jews' inability to live normal lives amongst Europeans. This is a bit of a fanciful image of life in the settlement, but particularly as the 19th century was coming to a close and the idea of nationalism was gaining traction throughout the world, Jews suffered repeated violent assaults known as pogroms. A lot of these were carried out by Tsar Alexander III of Russia, who used his Cossack henchmen, the people of the steppe, to raid Jewish villages. Those of you who are my age or older might remember a movie, Fiddler on the Roof, that is about those pogroms. I know none of my students know what I'm talking about whenever I mention that musical. Now, Palestine at this time had been inhabited by an Arab population at least since the 7th century, though there were communities that predated even that. Arab kingdoms that even were pre-Islamic traveled through this area. They served as important conduits for global trade that stretched along the Silk Road from China all the way to the Roman Empire. A lot of the Arabs in Palestine continued to live not in big cities, but in villages, though there were some big cities like the city of Jerusalem that was, of course, a cosmopolitan metropolis. One other picture of Palestine in this area in 1940. For many Jews making Aliyah, right, this return to Palestine, it was believed that they could redeem themselves through hard work, labor put in that would connect them to their ancient homeland. Some of the first Jews to arrive in the 19th century and into the 20th formed these co-ops called kibbutz, basically little communist societies where the wealth was shared equally, the work was shared equally, though many of these kibbutz dealt with the broader world as if they were corporations. Here, a couple of pictures of these Zionist settlers coming to transform the land. And in many cases, these settlers had agreed to purchase the land from its rightful owners. A big problem, though, a lot of the inhabitants of the area were not the owners. A lot of the owners were absentee landlords. So there's a big disconnect there. World War I complicated that factor because Palestine was a province of the Ottoman Empire. And this is where Europeans come in and kind of set the stage for the current problem. There's a famous book by David Frumkin calling World War I the war to end all peace. And essentially, the British themselves made 3 separate promises about what this land would look like when World War I was over, when presumably the Turkish Ottoman Empire would no longer exist. On the one hand, the British British Commissioner from Egypt, Sir Henry McMahon, had made a promise to Ottoman notable Sharif Hussein of Mecca, an important Arab leader in a big family, the Hashemite family, to create an Arab state throughout the region. But the British had also made a deal with the French to partition the Middle East between the two of them. This is known as the Sykes-Picot Agreement of 1916. And then, of course, there was the British Foreign Secretary, Arthur Balfour, who had promised Zionists that there would be the creation of a Jewish homeland in Palestine. And I do want to note, this word homeland does not say a Jewish state. Right? It was a place for them to go, but it was not a promise of a state. And Lord Balfour himself was probably acting out of his own anti-Semitism, believing that the best way for Europeans to deal with Jews was to get them out of the continent, to get them out of the way. He had also promised that this Jewish homeland would not prejudice the civil and religious rights of the existing non-Jewish communities inside Palestine. And so, again, there's a question, is this even possible to accomplish? Ultimately, it was that second bargain that took root, where essentially the Middle East was divided between the British and the French. And the boundaries of the Ottoman Empire, of the Arab portion of the Ottoman Empire, were divided to suit the interest of both the French and the English. The territory known as Palestine that we're focusing on was granted to the English. There was also part of a greater territory known as Transjordan across the Jordan River. But because the French had claimed Syria, they had an extra king to accommodate, so they had to break it in half. They broke it into Palestine and what is today known as Jordan. So this situation continued throughout World War I. Until 1948, Palestine was a British mandate. But as you know, there are a lot of things that happened in between World War I and 1948, one of those being, well, the Second World War. And the Second World War, of course, was when the Holocaust took place, the murder of about 6 million of the 12 million Jews in Europe, which gave extra impetus for the Jewish diaspora to come to Palestine. And this was made more urgent by the fact that Jews were not welcome in many other places of the world. So many Jews had settled in the region that the United Nations, that was formed to take the place of the League of Nations after the Second World War, was kind of left to deal with the problem. And they proposed a partition of Palestine and the creation of two states, a theme that we'll hear more than once today. This is that map here with the territory it looks white on this projector being the site of the new Jewish state, and the territory in brown being the site of a Palestinian Arab state. And you can kind of make out the borders of the Gaza Strip already forming here in this map that dates back all the way to 1947. As you could probably imagine, the Jewish population of Palestine was willing to accept this deal, though there were some groups that wanted more. A lot of groups actually wanted more, but the local Arab population refused. And there's a lot of discommunication between the Arab states that surrounded Palestine as well. The Sinai Peninsula was part of Egypt. Just imagine Egypt right off this map. Jordan is an Arab state. Syria is an Arab state. Lebanon was a more cosmopolitan state, but it is mainly an Arab state. And so when Jews declared the creation of the state of Israel, David Ben-Gurion, a former labor Zionist, becoming its first prime minister, the Arab states surrounding this new state of Israel declared war. Coordination was poor between these Arab states. The Jewish army, some of which consisted of organizations that we would call terrorist organizations, were victorious in defeating those Arab armies. And so that moment of success for the Jews, the foundation of the state of Israel on May 15th, 1948, is the Palestinians known as as the Nakba, the disaster or the catastrophe that sent large swaths of the population fleeing from the homes where they had lived for hundreds of years. About 700,000 Palestinians fled from these territories, about 500,000 of them heading to the Gaza, what is now the Gaza Strip, populating that region far beyond the capacity it could hold. This conflict, well, here's the map ultimately that emerged, where you can see on the left the Gaza Strip, where so much of the recent events have been happening. On the right there, that is a territory known as the West Bank. It's the West Bank of the Jordan River that divides Palestine from Jordan. The little thin part is the city of Jerusalem. The UN plan was to make Jerusalem an international city, and the zone around it an international city in the interest of peace. But the Jewish Defense Forces were able to seize western Jerusalem, but they lost the eastern part of the city, which to them was the most important part. There is a massive hill known to Jews as the Temple Mount, known to Arabs as the Noble Sanctuary. The Temple Mount is the site of the old Jewish temples from the ancient state of Israel. But to Muslims, the Noble Sanctuary is the site of the Dome of the Rock, the third holiest site in Islam. Matters got worse as time went on. Israel had trouble making peace with its neighbors. It was born out of war. And in 1967, in response to a buildup of military around Israel, the Israelis struck at its neighbors, at Egypt, at Jordan, and in Syria, and seized even more territory from the Arabs around there. In the top right, there's a territory known as the Golan Heights that overlooks the area of Galilee, where Syrians were firing weapons onto Jews below. Israel is still holding this territory, even though it is not acknowledged as part of Israel under the United Nations. The Israelis seized the West Bank that had been under the control of the Jordanians since 1948. They were controlling that area, and they seized Gaza, which had been under the control of Egypt. And they also went on all the way to the Suez Canal, a major shipping lane. If you remember, the ship Ever Given got trapped in the Suez Canal last year and seemed to have made a splash on social media. So it looked like the Zionist state had grown as a result of Israel's strength. This obviously is far from the end of the story, but for the people of Gaza, this is the beginning of the Israeli occupation. Right, that prior to the founding of Israel, Gaza was occupied by the British, and then it was occupied by Egypt, and now it is occupied by Israel and has remained so ever since. One of the things that the Israelis tried to pursue is a procedure for peace called Land for Peace. The idea that Israel can make a deal with the Arab countries in order to tone down the conflict between Arabs and Israelis. And Menachem Begin, one of these people that I think a lot of people would have called a terrorist for his days prior to the foundation of Israel, made a deal with Anwar Sadat, the president of Egypt, to hand the Sinai back to Egypt in exchange for peace. And Egypt becomes the first Arab state to make peace with Israel. This is 1978. In 1981, Sadat was reviewing his military. There was a parade, and a van drove by. Armed gunmen came out, shot him and many of his aides to death, making it clear that if you're a peacemaker in this region, there's a price to pay. The story repeated itself between Israel and the PLO in 1993. The PLO was an organization of numerous Palestinian government agencies working both within the territories and outside the territories as a representative of the Palestinian people. The accord negotiated in Oslo in 1993 would pursue even further that two-state solution, the creation of a Palestinian state in Gaza and the West Bank in exchange for peace with Israel. But the details were left unfulfilled in this treaty. And of course, Yitzhak Rabin paid the same price that Anwar Sadat did for his peacemaking. He was assassinated, again, by somebody who more extreme than he was. It was a Jewish law student named Yigal Amir, who shot Yitzhak Rabin. I'm still haunted by this image of him in court just smacking chewing gum as loud as possible while the charges were read against him for bringing an end to the peace process. And of course, assassinations have a way of derailing peace in general. And there's a period in which the labor government of Yitzhak Rabin, his successor, Barak, what's his name? Ehud Barak, thank you. I was getting confused with our president here, Ehud Barak. A man named Benjamin Netanyahu came to power in Israel. Netanyahu was a representative of the numerous settlers who were trying to settle amongst the Palestinian population in the West Bank and in the Gaza Strip. Making matters even worse, as the deal was about to close, a former IDF general and an opposition candidate named Ariel Sharon made a very provocative visit to the noble sanctuary, right, to the site where some Jews want to build another Jewish temple to replace the one destroyed by the Romans. But that would, of course, mean removing the Dome of the Rock, the very important Al-Aqsa Mosque that also rests atop the noble sanctuary. And this triggered massive riots that completely derailed the peace treaty. Now, twice in the history of this region, there were what Arabs called intifadas. Intifada literally means the sloughing off, as if sloughing off one's skin. Palestinians sloughing off the Israeli occupation. The first intifada mainly consisted of young Palestinians throwing rocks at Israeli soldiers, but some among them were more violent. They would put on vests of explosives and walk onto Israeli buses and blow themselves up, or come to checkpoints and blow themselves up. One of the organizations behind this was Hamas, the Islamic resistance movement founded by Sheikh Ahmed Yassin, seen here. Hamas began as a charitable organization, but became more intent on killing Jews than on liberating Palestine. They were less interested in a two-state solution. They weren't interested at all in a two-state solution, more interested in removing the state of Israel entirely. So Sharon, incidentally, Ariel Sharon, the man who provoked the second Intifada, became prime minister, and he recognized that it was impossible to hold on to the Gaza Strip. By this point, there were nearly 2 million people living in this piece of territory about the size of the city of Las Vegas, and with insufficient services. Among them, there were about 9,000 Israeli settlers that were attempting to displace that population. And Sharon thought the best way to deal with Gaza would be to pull those settlements out, to try and establish a separate government within Gaza. But he probably had in the back of his mind this idea of dividing the Palestinians against one another, dividing against the PLO. So he forcibly removed these Israeli settlers from the region. The very next year, elections were held, and Hamas was elected the government. There has not been an election held in the Gaza Strip since 2006. So it's been a long time. This territory has become extremely densely populated. As I mentioned, 2.5 million. Almost 50% of them are under 18. So when you hear stories, well, people dying in Gaza are children. Half the population is children, and Hamas has had a tendency to build military facilities very close to places like schools, to use hospitals as bases. And again, this isn't to justify the violence that is taking place. The violence has been horrible in the Gaza Strip as a result of this conflict. But this is one of the factors that help sets it up. Now, these are the events you're probably more familiar with. October 7th, 2023, began with what can only be described as a terrorist attack by Hamas that killed 1,400 Israelis, most of them civilians, and captured over 200 hostages. Meanwhile, the Israeli retaliation has caused the murder of what Palestinian sources say are about 9,000 deaths in airstrikes. The US government doesn't know if those numbers are precise, but they don't doubt the categorization. There are thousands that have died in Palestine. Furthermore, as the Strip is suffering from a breakdown of civil society, Hamas was just found to be hoarding both food, water, and medical supplies, as well as diesel fuel that they used to run the tunnels under the ground that they used to attack the state of Israel. This is from NBC News just this morning. So this is my presentation on the history of the Gaza Strip. Here's a map if we should need it later on. But I guess at this point I should turn over the microphone to Professor Haghighat.
Thank you very much for your wonderful review of what history, a very difficult and challenging task. I don't know how you did it, but honestly, I couldn't do it the way that what you did it. I really, really appreciate that. Really appreciate that. Again, you walk a very tightrope and always presenting what the history of Palestinian-Israeli conflict is not an easy task, you know. So I don't, my job is to put all these things in a historical context and explain and present a different version, or not different, complement what we just heard, this history, and add some political caveats to it, and see why we are here, what is happening, and where are we going from here. But before I start, I always say these things to my students in my classes, because teaching politics is not an easy task. Everybody is expert on politics. Everybody hears basically news and is convinced they are fully versed of what is happening in the world. So let me start by some disclaimers here. Is that take everything I'm going to share with you with a grain of salt. Do not, and I emphasize, do not believe what I'm going to tell you. Do your own research. Go find out if I'm sharing you historical facts, with credible historical facts. As a matter of fact, I challenge my students to prove me I'm wrong, because in that way I have persuaded them to become an independent thinkers and to do their own research and find the truth for themselves. Second, I don't know, as one of Ralph Nader one time shared with his audience is that his favorite motto was when his father, every time he came home as a son of Lebanese immigrant to the United States, his father, who was a simple shopkeeper, always told him, "My son, have you learned to believe today, or have you learned to think?" I sincerely hope that the whole point of this exercise, this discussion, would be to help us to think, not to believe. Third, I have to be always very cautious with my American audience or Iranian audience, wherever I go, because I adjust my presentation based on my audience. If I would be given this presentation to all Palestinians, my presentation would be very different. If I was giving this presentation to an Iranian audience, it would be completely different. But here we are. We are Americans. We are an American audience, and we are going. So my presentation is tailored toward the American audience. We have no control over what Palestinians do. We have no control over what Iranians do. We have no control over what other nations we have. But as an American citizens, as American voters, we can and we must do a lot to influence American foreign policy. So my presentation is tailored toward basically what American audience. And with that said, I have to always challenge myself, how much truth they can truly handle. As Jack Nicholson told when he was on, I think it was A Few Good Men or something like that, but when he said when Tom Cruise asked him to tell me the truth, he said, but you cannot handle the truth. I sincerely hope this audience can handle the truth. Because the truth that I'm going to cover, it is really challenging, at least, and again, once again, it is what I challenge you to go out there and find out if I'm sharing with you credible historical facts. And what again, I'm encouraging you to do not believe, but to think. It is hard to get the words exactly right, particularly in this situation that emotions are running so high while witnessing such unconscionable human tragedies being unfolded right in front of our eyes. And we all feel numb and helpless. And given how brutal the feelings are to the point that very many Americans are even afraid to say anything at all, we should be able to agree on a few fundamental principles. First, that it is wrong to kill innocent civilians, particularly children, whether they are Israeli children or Palestinian children. It is wrong to kill kids in concert halls, concert fields, or in kibbutz, or in a hospital, or in their home or refugee camps. In fact, it is morally repugnant. If we cannot agree on that, something has seriously gone wrong to our core of humanity and human decency. We should also agree that anti-Semitism and Islamophobia is wrong. Full stop, period. It should horrify anyone seeing attacks against Jewish and Muslim people in their houses of worship, workplace, universities, and while walking in the streets. Threatening violence against Jewish students at Cornell University or the anti-Semitic mob stormed an airport tarmac in Russia searching for Jewish passengers on a flight from Israel should shake all of us to our cores. And equally important, we should vehemently oppose DeSantis' bans of Palestinian student clubs at Florida colleges and universities, and make us sick to our stomach when a 7-year-old Muslim kid is stabbed to death while walking home from school. No matter how you feel about the government in Israel or its action in Gaza, that is not an excuse to take out your anger at Jewish people. As I will point out later in my presentation, some of the strongest Palestinian allies, yes, some of the strongest Palestinian allies and most die-hard opponents of Israel war in Gaza are Jewish people and Jewish organizations. As a matter of fact, most of my research and practically most of my knowledge about the history of Israeli-Palestinian conflicts are based on outstanding research and tireless work by some renowned Jewish scholars. Likewise, you cannot judge every Palestinian or every Muslim or Arab based on what murderous Hamas did to thousands of innocent Israeli civilians on October 7. As a matter of fact, the PLO leader, Mahmoud Abbas, has recently pointed out Hamas could care less if the entire people of Gaza are wiped out, as long as they remain in power. Yes, you cannot judge every Palestinian or every Muslim for Hamas actions. Any more than you cannot judge every American by the fact that some Americans elected a religious extremist-backed wannabe autocrat and multiple indicted criminal who tried to overthrow the government of the United States and still might be elected president of the most powerful nation in the world. A country that has given a divine right to itself to export democracies to other nations. That is another story for another time. With that said, let us focus on the most heart-wrenching crisis in Gaza and put it in some historical context from the point of view of the people who are at the receiving end of these unconscionable human tragedy unfolding right in front of our eyes on a daily basis. For the past weeks, Israeli response to Hamas murderous act of October 7 has been dropping bombs on one of the mostly densely populated area of the world, while for the most part depriving them from food, electricity, water, and any basic human needs for survival. Israeli jets have bombarded not just northern Gaza, but southern Gaza too, despite Israeli officials calling on Palestinians to flee south and giving them the so-called safe haven. And given these bombardments are being done by using our tax dollars, perhaps we should ask some few questions. For example, how does bombing densely populated land strip filled with 50% children constitute self-defense? How does flattering the hospitals and killing the newborns in their incubators and patients with broken legs or cancer or doctors, nurses, not constitute a war crime? If you say all of these actions are not violations of international laws or Geneva Convention agreements because Hamas terrorists are hiding in tunnels under those hospitals and schools, you are wrong. And I have several of my MUN students here who can point you to the international laws that make all those actions crimes against humanity. And we should also ask, what is the end game in all of this? During the discussion, I would argue that at the end of this, Hamas will come out of this more powerful than ever before because of the action of Israeli government. And how we can put this recent crisis into historical. So let's put what all of those was said. Let's put all these things in historical context and see why we have been seeing this horror picture on the world stage over and over for the past 75 years. And do we ever learn from history? What I'm doing wrong. Okay. You mentioned Nakba. But so let's pause for a second. Nakba is not something that was just a footnote in history, and something that it is at the core of what Palestinian-Israeli conflict. And by the way, Nakba is a term that is usage is illegal in the state of Israel. It's illegal to commemorate Nakba. It is illegal to mention Nakba, and you will be severely punished by the state of Israel. Think about that. Just imagine that African Americans in the United States would be criminalized if they criticize slavery or even mention slavery. Imagine if our indigenous people in the United States would be criminalized if they opposed Christopher Columbus and his arrival to the United States, or Columbus Day. This several United Nations commissions and countless historians have cited that unfortunate manner that Israel as a Jewish state was established in a land which most of its population were Palestinians. That process is called Nakba, a term that its usage is denied by Israel and legally banned in the country, in the same manner as DeSantis and people like him have banned the critical race theory in the United States. One of Israel's founders, Yosef Wiltz, who was the prime mover behind the first and second transfer committee, and between 1932 to 1948, he was the powerful director of the Jewish National Fund's land settlement. This is a quote from him. It must be clear that there is no room in the country for both Arab and Jewish peoples. If the Palestinian Arabs live it, the country will become wide and spacious for us. The only solution after the end of World War II is a land of Israel, at least a western land of Israel, i.e. Palestine, since Transjordan is the eastern portion. Without Palestinian Arabs, there is no room here for compromises. There is no way but to transfer the Palestinian Arabs from here to the neighboring countries, to transfer all of them, save perhaps for the Palestinians, Arabs of Bethlehem, Nazareth, and what. Not one village must be left, not one tribe. The transfer must be direction at Iraq, Syria, and even Transjordan. For this goal, funds will be found. And only after this transfer will the country be able to absorb millions of our brothers, and the Jewish problem will cease to exist. There is no other solution. That is Nakba for Palestinians. According to the data documentation of World War II Palestinian war, Israelis controlled 774 towns and villages during Nakba. They destroyed 531 Palestinian towns and villages. Israeli forces' atrocities also included more than 70 massacres against Palestinians, killing 15,000 Palestinians during Nakba time. Throughout the process of Nakba, Israel has managed to control 80% of the land and eradicated or forcefully removed more than 50% of the Arab population from the land. And the Nakba continues. Again, I hear over and over and over in American mass media, what is the end game in Gaza? The reason that I'm going over Nakba, I hope that I'm shedding some light. What is the end game in Nakba from the state of Israel, what perspective? Is it truly to end Hamas, or to what? Forcefully remove more Palestinians from Gaza? I want you to be the judge. Five is Israeli law discovered. We keep hearing about what Israel is the only democracy in Middle East. We keep hearing. Frankly, what to me and what I also said, there are some cliches, some statements that what we have heard it over and over and over, and we never question it, and what it becomes facts to us and what I face. And we have heard that Israelis, Middle Easterns are not used to democracy. They don't know what is democracy. What Israel is the only democracy in the Middle East. Well, I have a news for you. The fact that I'm standing here as an Iranian born has everything to do with what we desired democracy. We wanted democracy. We elected Prime Minister Prime Minister Mossadegh in 1951. We had democracy. And guess what? Our choice was not acceptable to the United States. CIA under Operation Ajax came in, overthrew Dr. Mossadegh, and established an authoritarian dictatorial regime in Iran, and the rest is history. My life and generations of Iranians' life, was turned upside down. So please do not tell me I don't know what democracy means, or I don't know what. We tried democracy. And by the way, Dr. Mossadegh was a secular government. One of his principles was separation of religion from state. And by the way, CIA recruited the highest religious authority in Iran, Ayatollah Kashani, to topple Dr. Mossadegh in Iran. So yes, we desire secular regimes. Yes, we desire democracy. But unfortunately, it was not acceptable to the United States. So please do not tell Middle Easterns that they don't know democracy. They don't desire democracy. Now, Israel is the only democracy in the Middle East? Okay, it depends from whose perspective. Who is at the receiving end of this democracy? Here is 5 ways what Israeli law discriminates against Palestinians. Right to acquire and lease land, basic law. The Knesset Israeli parliament passed the basic law on July 19, 2018. Israeli lands, the stipulates that ownership of Israeli land controlled by the State Jewish National Fund and the Development Authority can only be transferred between the 3 entities, knowing that JNF leases land is owned to Jews only. 93% of the land in Israel is public and belongs to the state or the Development Authority. 13% is controlled by JNF, which has a hugely influential role in Israeli policy. Palestinian citizens are blocked from leasing about 80% of the land controlled by the state. Right to return. According to the absentees property law, Palestinian refugees expelled after November 29, 1947 are absentees and are denied any rights. Their land, houses, apartments, and bank accounts, movable and immovable property were confiscated by the state. Simultaneously, the law of return 1950 gave Jews from everywhere in the world the right to automatically become Israeli citizens. I want you to think about it. A Palestinian born and raised for generations in that part of the land is being expelled and has no right to return to the land. And a Jewish person from anywhere in the world has the right to go there and automatically becomes what? Citizen of that what state. Is that your definition of democracy? Right to residency. For Palestinians who have a permanent resident status to live in Jerusalem, entry into and residency in Jerusalem is a revocable privilege. Privilege. A revocable privilege. Not a right, but privilege. A privilege instead of inherent right. Since 1967, nearly 15,000 Palestinians from East Jerusalem have had their residency rights revoked, according to the Interior Ministry. Authorities justified most revocation on the basis of failing to prove that Jerusalem is their center of life. And how do they fail to prove? They forced them out of that area for the long period of time. In March 2018, Israel passed a law allowing the Interior Minister to revoke the residency rights of any Palestinian in Jerusalem on the grounds of breach of loyalty to Israel. So if you are not loyal to Israel, you don't have the right to your house, to your place of residency. Can you imagine if we had that law in the United States? I have to breach loyalty to President Trump or in order to have the right to my home. The Interior Minister can strip the residency status of any Palestinian deemed to be a threat. These policies do not apply to the Jewish population. If you just do some Google search, you see that each year a number of Palestinians are being deported. I ask my students, what does deporting mean? Can you imagine if United States of America, government of the United States, grabbed you, born and raised in the United States, and deport you? Deport you to where? You're American. You were born and raised in this country. How can you deport Palestinians from Palestine? Deport them to where? That's their native land. Right to commemorate Nakba. Palestinians' tradition remarkable, as I've already explained, that what Palestinians do not have the right to what Nakba. The Nakba law introduced in 2000 allows the finance minister to reduce fundings or support to an institution if it holds an activity that commemorates Israeli Independence Day as a day of mourning. The law causes major harm to principle of equality and so on and so forth. Now, the admission committee law allows towns to operate panels that deny applications for entry based on socio-cultural compatibility, essentially legalizing housing discrimination. This is not me. This is Amnesty International. Amnesty International. This is not a phrase that what I use. Poor Jimmy Carter used what? Apartheid. And he was the first president and the only president ever banned from his own party's national convention. His crime was that what he wrote a book calling what the state of Israel an apartheid system. Al Gore did not invite him to his convention. A former president of the United States was banned from his own party convention because he dared to use apartheid as a title of his book. This is Amnesty International. In March, Israeli authorities re-entered the citizenship and entry into Israeli law, temporary. That imposes sweeping restriction on Palestinian family unification between Israeli citizens or residents and their spouses from the up to maintain a Jewish demographic majority. Israeli Supreme Court upheld the law authorizing the Interior Minister to strip citizenship of their citizens of their citizenship if convicted of acts that amount to breach of allegiance to the state. Since enactment, you can read that how many Israelis or how many Palestinians have been penalized by that. Now, why I'm sharing all of this with you? As I said, you're an American audience, and that's what my presentation is telling. Because the United States has unconditional support of the state of Israel. Unconditional support. U.S. foreign aid to Israel. According to October 14, 2003 of Visual Capitalist, Israel has been the leading recipient of U.S. foreign aid since 1940s. Since the end of World War II, the U.S. has dispersed more than $3.75 trillion in foreign aid, adjusted for inflation. The post-war years saw foreign aid peak, primarily because of the Marshall Plan. This initiative aid at its highest in 1949, U.S. foreign aid totaled $100 billion. Israel has been by far the largest cumulative recipient of U.S. foreign assistance. Since 1940s, Israel has received more than $300 billion, with most of it in military support, aiding the country in developing missile defense system and such. U.S. military aid. Israel, the highest recipient of military aid from the United States. Last year, the United States gave $3.3 billion in military aid to Israel. And yesterday, U.S. Senator Tom Scott co-sponsored the Israeli Supplement Appropriation Act, which would provide $14.3 billion to the state of Israel. Right now, we are fighting with everything we got with our college. Our union leadership is fighting to get health care for part-time faculty. Health care for part-time faculty, and we are said we don't have money. And we are giving $14.3 billion to a nation that has national health care. So we are subsidizing health care for another country, but healthcare for ourselves is a taboo. We don't have money. United States and UK have practically vetoed any UN Security Council resolution against Israel, including the most recent resolution calling for ceasefire in Gaza. Any UN resolution against the state of Israel. I underline, highlight, emphasize the word any. Any UN resolution. And Israel has violated more than 63 UN resolutions, including UN Resolution 242, and countless other UN resolution and Geneva Agreement. And any of those have been vetoed by United States. Gaza death toll. In his news, I want you to pay attention to the first one. In his news conference, President Biden cast out on Gaza death toll. He said, well, I understand some people are dying, but I don't seriously doubt the number that what Palestinians are mentioning. So what did Palestinian official responded with 6,747 names. Women, children, and the elderly make up 73% of those killed by Israeli bombardments in Gaza. Look at the numbers. Look at the numbers. More than 70% of Gaza population, comprising 1.7 million people, are refugees. Most of them live in or near Gaza refugee camps. These camps were established, and Dan went over it, so I'm not going to go over that. Thank you very much, Dan, for taking your time. Am I suggesting that Israelis have not been massacred? Israelis have not been killed? Absolutely not. Am I suggesting that Hamas does not have genocidal intention? Absolutely not. Am I suggesting that Hamas action was acceptable? Absolutely not. If you hear any of those, then you are hearing wrong. Hamas action was a terrorist act, was genocidal, was and was, it has to be, it must be condemned in the strongest form. So is Israeli action. So is Israeli action. Look at the human cost of Israeli-Palestinian conflict. This is according to the United Nations. These are not my figures. These are United Nations figures. Look at the number of casualties on each side. How can I click on this? This is very short, but I want to give you some idea. This is Israeli defense minister. We don't have volume?
אין מים, אין דלק. הכל סגור. אנחנו נלחמים בחיות אדם. אנחנו מטילים מצור מוחלט על העיר עזה. אין חשמל, אין מזון, אין מים, אין דלק. הכל סגור. אנחנו נלחמים בחיות אדם ואנחנו נוהגים בהתאם.
So no food, no electricity, no water to 2 million population, a large number of them children, and calling them animals. And this is not just any person. This is Israeli Prime Minister. McCarthyism and the loss of liberty at home. With all of this, what is happening to us? And this is not the first time. This happened at UC Irvine. There has been a war between Hamas and Israelis and a war in Gaza and so on and so forth. The last one time, Palestinian students decided to protest the speech given by Israeli ambassador at UC Irvine. And look what happened. 11 of them were expelled from UC Irvine. And the thing that really tore my heart apart, The law was written by one scholar that I really looked up to him. I really was one of the first defender of individual liberty in the United States. He is the one who authored the expulsion of 11 Palestinian students who dared to challenge Israeli Prime Minister at their campus. That is the loss. This is not the loss of liberty for Palestinians. This is the loss of liberty and academic freedom on US campuses. This is your loss, this is my loss, this is the loss of freedom of expression for all of us. For all of us. As what is happening, the history is repeating itself again. DeSantis bans pro-Palestinian student groups in Florida. Now, Palestinian students do not have the right to even form a club in Florida. Editor fired after sharing Onion article on Israeli and Hamas. Israel has demanded the resignation of United Nations Secretary General. United Nations Secretary General. The demand came after Guterres made remarks against Israeli counteroffensive in Gaza. I encourage you, I purposely did not write his speech here because I want you to go and read and see what is so offensive about he says. He condemned Hamas in the strongest term, but he dared to also criticize Israel. And Israel is demanding the Secretary General of United Nations to be fired. Israel to refuse visas to UN officials after Guterres' speech. Web Summit CEO Patty Congress resigns over Israeli war. What did she say? She said that violation of international law is violation of international law, even if it's done by our own allies. That was so offensive that she was forced to resign. NYU law student has a job offer withdrawn after posting anti-Israeli comment. Anti-Israeli when criticizing Israeli action in Gaza and demanding for ceasefire. Netanyahu, Prime Minister of Israel, used biblical rationalization of Israeli massacre in Gaza. This happened this weekend. And this weekend, in his speech, Netanyahu suggested, you must remember what Amalek has done to you as a Holy Bible says. Amalek was a nation described in Hebrew Bible as a staunch enemy of the Israelis. This is the verse, if you are not familiar with. Now go, attack the Amaleks and totally destroy all that belongs to them. Do not spare them. Put to death men and women, children and infants, cattle and sheep, camels and donkeys. Now you decide, is this a call for self-defense or genocide and ethnic cleansing? But the hope is that there are so many Jewish people who are at the forefront of challenging Israeli action and calling for ceasefire. And this is from this morning, Huffington Post, that many Jews are speaking out. Many Jews are challenging Israeli action and criticizing and asking others to join them to stop this madness. Renowned Jewish Israeli historians and social thinkers like Ian Papa, Naomi Klein, Noam Chomsky, and the list goes on and on. I highly recommend that you read what Ian Papa's on Gaza and war, hostages, the context behind current violence. These are all Jewish scholars. Now, I know it's a lot to unpack. And sometimes it feels like an impossible conversation. But we need to have it anyway, today or tomorrow or in many days and years to come. Unfortunately, the way that this madness is being unfolded, that unfortunately the situation is going to get only bloodier and worse, and the bloody history of what Palestinian-Israeli conflict is going to continue for a long time to come and haunt us, and our tax money is going to go for it. And unfortunately, anti-Semitism has rise, and believe it or not, and I hope you don't believe me, and again you go and research it, the major threat to Jewish people is not coming from Palestinian, but is from the far right. From the far right. In groups like Proud Boys, groups that are by definition racist. And unfortunately, these days, the roles have been reversed and so on and so forth. Some of the strongest supporters of the state of Israel, and actually Israel is some of the most racist individuals, like Steve Bannon. So I really leave it up to you to think about it and try to digest this, and now I welcome your questions.
Okay, thank you to both Dr. Borses and Dr. Haghighat. We did run a little long. However, I believe we have the space, so we will take this opportunity to field some questions from the audience. I do have a few that have come from the Political Science Student Association. So let me first of all put a microphone over here for the two of you. Okay. So the first question. What is the viability at this point of a one-state solution or a two-state solution? And are those viable at all?
I think the two-state solution is probably the only thing viable, though I would not know how we get there from here. I know that the Israelis have this complicated mission, which is to have a state that is Jewish and a democracy. But because of the relative population growth of Palestinians, that's going to be soon impossible. If there were one state in Palestine, right now it would be about 7 million Jews, about 7 million Arabs, both Christian and Muslim. So I think the two-state solution is probably the more likely. And especially because, well, Joe Biden has indicated that that's the path he would like to pursue. And the United States does tend to get its way in Israel, if not right away, eventually.
Dr. Haghighat?
I think I agree with that. What is a two-state solution might be a viable path, but unfortunately, once again, I don't think either what Israel wants it. Israel has opposed this two-state solution, and I don't think Israel wants it. I don't think Hamas wants it. I really would think what is going to happen, the way that this war is being waged, is going to it would simply add to more anger, resentment, bloodshed, hostility, and so on and so forth for years to come. And I'm afraid if in America, we don't raise our voice. If we don't join these organizations that are calling for ceasefire and viable alternatives, the situation is going to worse. Just look at the history that what will happen. We went to Iraq. We occupied that countries for more than 20 years. We went to Afghanistan. We occupied that country for 20 years. What did we accomplish? We dropped bomb on everything that moved. What did we accomplish? One of the byproducts of Iraq was ISIS. See, the question I have is that how is bombing people is going to destroy Hamas? For every person is killed, some of his family members are going to be future Hamas. And I'm afraid if we continue, how is Biden going to support two-state solution when he even vetoes ceasefire? And what does ceasefire mean anyway? What is so dangerous about ceasefire? It means that immediate dropping bomb and no more bomb on Gaza, no more rockets being fired as Israel, hostage prisoner swap, food and what, more humanitarian aid going to what, and more discussion and what, and hopefully reducing what this rise of anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, and so on and so forth. But unfortunately, that's not the route we are going. So if we are going the other way, I don't know how we are going to even talk about two-state solution or one-state solution. To me, as a political scientist, I think the only alternative that is going to work is one-state solution. In one state that everybody is equal. Period, end of discussion. But if we go for two-state solution, and one state is always dependent on the other state for economic aid, financial and so on and so forth, how is that going to last? How is it going to, especially in that region, And the other statistic that I want to show you is that I want you to see that every time there has been a war in Middle East, every time there has been a war in Middle East, that there has been a surge of arms sale to the region, and every time after that there has been a surge of arms sale. And if I bother your conscience, I'm sorry, but that is your tax money. United States is one of the countries that is pouring arms into the region. So I don't know how we can talk about any of this solution when we are continuing on the path of destruction, mayhem, and bloodshed.
Thank you. The second question, has Hamas, through its actions, advanced the Palestinian cause and interests, or has it hindered progress towards a resolution of the Israel-Palestine conflict?
I would say it has hindered it because they don't want a solution. The official line of Hamas is, from the river to the sea, and that means getting rid of the state of Israel with its 9 million people. So Hamas has, I think it's made it more difficult for Palestinians. And as I mentioned in my presentation, and you can see in the news as well, and then Professor Haghighat mentioned this as well, Hamas would not mind killing every last Palestinian to achieve that goal. So Hamas absolutely has made it worse. There's not going to be peacemakers coming out of Hamas, but there are plenty of peacemakers coming out of the Palestinian society, I would say.
Thank you for that question. I think that is a real question. That's a real question. Why did we go over this history? It's not to rationalize what Hamas did. It's not to justify Hamas did. It's to simply explain when you have a nation historically oppressed, their basic human rights are denied. They are facing bloodshed, massacre, expulsion, and eradication. They're bound to react. They're going to resist. They're going to fight back. That's a human nature. You would do that. You would do that. But some of the reaction is going to be ethical, is going to be moral, is going to be constructive. Some of the resistance, some of them are going to be immoral, unethical, destructive. Unfortunately, we are at fault by silencing the ethical, moral, constructive voices. And the more we do that, I provided you an example of that, several examples of that. Once we silence the moral, ethical, constructive voices, guess what? We have left the room, the stage open for what? For the immoral, destructive, forces to take the lead. And unfortunately, that is the challenge that we are facing. So collectively, we should demand ceasefires. We should demand freedom of expression. We should bring to the forefront the ethical, constructive voices of reason and what providing what meaningful alternative for Palestinians to live as human beings. Otherwise, what we will have mayhem, destruction, and what and bloodshed.
Okay, I have one last question from our students before I open up to the audience. How can we draw meaningful comparisons and contrasts between the U.S. invasion of Iraq following the 9/11 attacks and the ongoing Israel-Palestine conflict? What lessons, if any, can be applied from the former to the latter in terms of international relations, conflict resolution, and the consequences of military intervention?
Guess I get to go first again. And that's an absolutely wonderful question, because there is no doubt that the United States went and attacked people who weren't our enemy under the guise of the attack of September 11th. And I actually was heartened to see President Biden warning the Israelis publicly not to make that same mistake. There's really no comparison, though, between Iraq, that had nothing to do with 9/11 in any way, and what's going on here. Israel was directly attacked. Hamas took responsibility for that attack. The problem is the architecture of the Gaza Strip makes it impossible to go after Hamas without the civilian cost. And I agree with Professor Haghighat that a ceasefire would do a lot to save the Palestinians who are not Hamas. Opening border crossings to allow people to flee somewhere where they actually can be cared for would be a very good idea, not just into Egypt, though I know that the people of the Gaza Strip might be hesitant to leave for fear they may never be allowed back in. The history has shown that it's a mistake to leave. But the situation in Iraq was very different. If we were to see the Israelis go after some other Palestinian groups that weren't involved in this, that would be a similar mistake. But the consequences of this war has just been absolutely devastating for the Palestinians in the Gaza Strip. Just absolutely horrendous all the way through. But it's a tough situation, and it's above my pay grade to come up with a solution to this. But again, how do you fight an enemy that hides itself in hospitals, that digs tunnels, uses aid money to build tunnels to use for an attack? In many ways, the Palestinian people are occupied by both Israel and Hamas at this point. And beyond that, I just don't see that many commonalities between them.
Yeah, definitely. I would start with that point. Thank you very much. One common thing that I see is that when 9/11 took place, it was horrible. I remember the day that I never forget that day. My wife called me and said, "Just come." I was getting ready to come to school that day, and my wife called me and said, "Just see what is happening here." And I saw that, and my heart fell. When I saw the plane go to the second building, my heart fell. And I couldn't hold back my tears, just thinking about the innocent people, both in the plane as well as the building where were being perished. But I turned to my wife and said, the world has changed. The world will change forever now. This is not going to be the same. The next day, I hear what George Bush, when they asked him why this happened, his response was that this happened because we are the envious of the world. We are the beacon of liberty, and we are the envious of the world. Seriously? That is your response? That is your understanding why what these attacks took place? Has nothing to do with the years of what ventures in the Middle East and other parts of the world, and what depriving individual liberties, depriving people from their for basic rights and so on and so forth. That's your response? That's your response? But anyway, so I see the same thing here also, but that's where the similarity ends. What I am really what bothers me, when I hear the mass media keep comparing what Israel is doing with the United States and has said, and keep comparing with Iraq and Israel. Let me tell you why they are very different. First of all, the United States had not occupied Iraq or Afghanistan. Israel is an occupier nation. Occupier nation. United States as a savagery in what was unleashed in what those countries and the number of innocent people, please go do your research and see. We destroyed Iraq. Iraq as a nation was destroyed. Many innocent people's were alive. So is what we impacted the lives of Americans. My daughter is a psychiatric specialist. She is at VA hospital, and her patients are Iraqi veterans. And she comes home with horror stories about the psychological impact of the war on them. And not to mention tax dollars, not to mention all of those aside. But with all that said, the goal of the United States was not to annex Iraq. The goal of the United States was not to wipe out the entire Iraqi nation as a whole. We just talk about NAPCA. That has been a systematic policy of the state of Israel to expel as many Palestinians as possible from the land and to control as many lands as much land. When Nakba started, they have succeeded now controlling more than 50% they have wiped out more than 50% of the population and forcefully removed them, and have expanded their control to 80%. The end goal of Israel is not just to destroy Hamas, to push Palestinians as much as possible from Gaza and never allow them to come back. And then to control as much as land is Gaza. That to me is fundamentally different from the war in Iraq and Afghanistan. There are many similarities, but the end goal is different. The United States didn't have any end goal there, but I'm afraid Israel has an end goal here. And that end goal is not what we are seeking.
Would you like to respond, Dr. Borses?
Just wondering, the feasibility that the Israelis could seriously remove the Palestinians from the Gaza Strip, that it seems absolutely impossible to accomplish. It's clearly the dream of Netanyahu. It's clearly the dream of the finance minister that you quoted. But I think there's a realization that you can't get rid of 2 million people. Israel has the power to do that. It could have done it long ago. But instead, they have made efforts to weaken Palestinians, but they have provided Gaza with minimal electricity, water, food, far less than it deserves. But I find it almost impossible to believe that Israel would try to remove the Palestinians from Gaza if they got rid of Hamas. Again, I separate Hamas and the general Palestinian population here, and I just can't imagine any of the people I have engaged with who are Israeli wanting to see that as well. It just seems like it would be beyond the pale, sorry to use that expression. Well, they live in Qatar. They don't even live in the Gaza Strip.
Okay, if you couldn't hear that, I'll say, and I'll ask you to move the microphone very closely. The question was, where do Hamas leaders live? And Dr. Haghighat said in Qatar. They don't live in the Gaza Strip. So they're not being hit anyway. So one of the things that you're hearing is that Hamas leadership is being killed in these attacks, and there's widespread skepticism that that's actually happening.
But the operational leaders live in the Gaza Strip, the people who carried out the October 7th attack.
Right, the tacticians. One of the things that also we want to clarify is there's a difference between tactics, between people carrying out an operational mission and those who actually do the planning, who do the strategy, and it's the strategists who are in Qatar, and the operational advisors that are in Gaza, probably underground.
Unfortunately, I respectfully disagree because if you look, the way I look at the history of Israel-Palestinian conflict has been the war of attrition. What time is that Israel's hand, and time is something that Palestinians do not have. Another thing that Palestinians do not have is the support of United States, England, and so on and so forth in the Security Council. Every time it goes to the United Nations, the United States, England, and so on and so forth come in on side of what Israel and veto any resolution. Who would have thought Jerusalem as a neutral state, like Vatican, would one day become capital of the state of Israel? But Trump made it happen. What happened? The word what quiet and what odds that happened now is a faith accomplished. Faith accomplished. For the past, since 1967, West Bank, West Bank and has been considered an occupied land, occupied territory. There has been so many UN resolutions against Israel. Has there been even one sanction against the state of Israel? And what is the state of Israel is doing is keep expanding settlement in those territories. And keep expanding to a point and keep expelling Palestinians to a point that there was really nothing left of Palestinians. I'm afraid this is a war that is going to go on for a long time and political consultative powers are on the side of Israel, and that's something that Palestinians do not have. And that's what I'm suggesting. The end goal is to what has been always the end goal, as the founder of one of the founders said, to expel as many as Palestinians as possible, and to capture as much land as possible. And to me, what is happening in Gaza today is not any different from what has been happening for the past 75 years.
Okay, I do have time for a question. I think we might have a couple. I'm not sure when this room might be utilized again, but I'll ask Dr. Morfkhani.
Thank you for the presentation. It's been very helpful. Appreciate it. It's very tragic and difficult to stomach some of these details. I wanted to first preface with one thing, and I know I'm not supposed to preamble, but we have given near $5.2 billion in humanitarian aid to Palestinian organizations through U.S. aid since 1994. There is that little detail to add. Just yesterday, we proposed another $100 million in humanitarian aid through the Biden administration. So, our tax dollars are spread in all kinds of interesting ways that are often not privy to us, right? And for very strategic purposes. I'm not being naive here. I'm just pointing this out. And the other part that there's a lot of comparisons that you brought out specifically, Dr. Haghighat, in the speech about, can you imagine if the United States did X, Y, or Z? And there would be problems if the United States did X, Y, or Z, but the situations are not exactly identical. So some of those comparisons become stretched and difficult. And that's the question I have is that, are you aware of, you said the last 75 years, any instances in which a two-state partition solution might have been possible, but were compromised by disagreements on the part of Arab nations? Are you aware of any moments like that in the 75-year history?
Excellent questions, and excellent. Kevin, as I suggested at the beginning, if I would have give this presentation to Arab audience and Palestinian audience, or basically they said, it would have been fundamentally different. My doctoral dissertation is about basically, rather than pointing fingers at others, looking at what we are doing wrong. So my doctoral dissertation is one thing that the United States launched a coup d'etat in Iran, but we have to also acknowledge our own Iranian people's failures, the internal dynamics internal dynamics we did the internal dynamics. I mentioned Ayatollah Khashoggi was one of as the highest religious leader in Iran, sided with the CIA. So So the Tudor party, the Communist Party, had its own what historical failures and what lack of understanding. So that goes without saying. But yes, there has been time and and there has been occasions. I will tell you that scores of Palestinians have been killed by Arab nations, by Jordanians, by Syrians, by scores of Palestinians. One cannot ignore that. Scores of Palestinians. I said Hamas doesn't give a damn about what? The lives, the loss of lives, in Gaza. Exactly. Absolutely. It's in the charter. But here is the situation. It's like institutional racism. It's what there is, to me, is a different, when a black person is at the receiving end of institutional racism and as opposed to the feeling that a black person has toward a white person. What I'm suggesting here is that maybe let's go back to Middle Easterns. When Palestinians historically have been used as a piece of chess game between Arab nations, Iran now, and Israel and United States and so on and so forth. That is a fact. That's undeniable fact. Right now, for example, United States went to Iraq and basically bombed the hell out of Iraq and overthrew. The main beneficiary of the war in Iraq was Iran. Iran now controls most of Iraq, controls most of Syria, and I am not going to be shocked if at the end, once DOS is settled, Iran is going to be a major beneficiary of this bloodshed and mayhem that is taking place right now in Gaza. So yes, those dynamics, but the fact that we have to also take into consideration, Palestinians have been forced to operate in complete secrecy. Because they cannot even elect their leaders because they are identified, picked up, and killed by Israelis. When an organization is operating in that kind of climate, is that so talking about open discussion, exchange of ideas, freedom of expression, and expecting them to behave like what Israelis is unrealistic. So we have to put that into the context. Yes, but there is animosity between Arab nations. Yes, they have been a major obstacle to those of the, because most of them are also puppet or dependent on the West. One of the worst violators of human rights in Middle East is Saudi Arabia, if not worse than Israel. What Saudi Arabia? But is another major recipient of foreign aid from the United States. And if you look at the timing of this war, that timing of the Gaza is really, really at best suspicious. At best is suspicious. There are several factors at best is suspicious. Why this happened exactly at a time that what Biden administration is facilitating a peace talk between and normalization of relationship between Israel and Saudi Arabia. Absolutely. Why is that happening right now? And so there are many, many questions that needs to be answered. But it is not fair to evaluate, to judge Palestinians who have been operating in secrecy, operating in war, they're victims of manhunt and so on and so forth, in the same manner that we basically evaluate and people who are sitting in democratic societies and we have the free exchange of ideas and so on and so forth. So that's, and unfortunately, as I said, Palestinians have always been used as pieces of diplomatic strategic of other nations. and they are the real victims.
Okay, thank you. I have another question.
Hello, professors, Dr. Borges and Dr. Haghighat. First, I want to thank you for the presentation. It's very informative. But to start my question off, I want to draw attention to two phenomena happening right now. There's worldwide protests for ceasefires as we speak, but also as we speak, Israel is currently doing the ground invasion. And the stated plan of Netanyahu is do the ground invasion first, get the hostages second, because they don't negotiate with terrorists. So my question is, what would be the goal of Netanyahu to, how do I say, do this land invasion, and why is there this philosophy within Western powers of not to negotiate with terrorists?
So the question is why not negotiate with terrorists? I just want to make sure. And why the ground invasion would precede any negotiations.
Yeah, I mean, one thing to think about with Netanyahu is he is an ideologue. In the same way I tried to separate Hamas from Palestine, I would like to separate Netanyahu from Israel. That I don't think Netanyahu really cares all that much about the hostages, and I think the Israeli public is on to that, at least judging by the stuff I've seen in Haaretz lately, that the ground invasion is more important to him. Yeah, and as far as this idea, you don't negotiate with terrorists, Israel has that policy. If you hit them, they'll hit you back with what they see as proportional. And just 2 days ago, we were planning this presentation, and I had learned, the news always happens while I'm in class in the morning, that the Yemeni Houthis had sent the missile into Israel, and Israel hasn't even deemed it important enough to respond to it. That they're trading rocket fire with Hezbollah in Lebanon, but again, there's no ground invasion. That so much of this is noise that's going on. The real action is what's going on in Gaza right now, and I think Netanyahu legitimately doesn't want this attack to be his legacy. That by getting back at Hamas, he thinks he can clean his legacy. He's got a long history of a Zionist family. His father wrote one of the books I read about the early Zionists. His older brother is an Israeli hero who was killed rescuing hostages in Entebbe, Uganda. When was that? In the 70s or 80s, early 80s, right? In Entebbe. And I think Netanyahu's interest is more in cleaning his reputation than in, more in cleaning his reputation than getting those hostages back.
And not to mention, he is facing major criminal charges in Israel, the same way that 9/11 came to the rescue of George Bush, whose popularity was extremely down, and after 9/11 he was able to consolidate his presidency and so on and so forth. Netanyahu is facing major charges, corruption charges in Israel, major corruption charges in Israel, and this is something that now has diverted attention from that and so on and so forth. But also Netanyahu has a long history. One of the slides that I had is his Minister of Justice, who literally called for act of genocide, killing Palestinians and killing their mothers because they have given birth to these little snakes, and that's Minister of Justice of Netanyahu. So his record is not that shining. This past weekend he just gave that speech using a biblical term. I mean that's dangerous. That is really serious issues.
Okay, we have a time for a couple more questions, so I have
Real
one.
quick add one last comment, something that Professor Haghighat reminded me of, something important, that Yasser Arafat, the man who signed the Oslo Accords, used to say that the Palestinians have a secret weapon, and that's the Palestinian womb. So to see so much discussion about womb, both nations, Palestine and Israel, are natalists, that they're trying to recover their population. For the Jews, recovering from the Shoah, from the Holocaust; from the Palestinians, recovering from the Nakba. And so women's wombs are at the center of the imagery in discussing the nation. So apologies for interrupting. I just thought that was worth adding in.
So sitting through this presentation, my mind goes back to the Vietnam War and the protests that took place then. If this situation worsens and the U.S. does get more involved, could we expect to see an increase in the backlash against students with opposing views?
So do you mean a backlash among Americans against? Well, a lot of the backlash against the Vietnam War was because of the draft, that you only had to be 18 to be drafted, and you had to be 21 in order to vote against the people who drafted you. So I think the situation is very different. Also in the Vietnam War, that was an issue of race as well, that white people had more options of getting out of the draft, and so we were disproportionately sending, well, black Americans, poor Americans, to fight the war. But I don't see a connection. What about you?
Unfortunately, the power to be has learned a lot from what is mistakes in Vietnam. So there is a book that I highly recommend to what I assign to my students and what I highly recommend to the audience. It's called Cracks in the Empire. It was actually a doctorate dissertation of what a student that who studied what the lessons that the power to be, United States, learned from the war in Vietnam, so to make sure that when the next time they wage a war, they would not face a domestic front, domestic opposition, the way that what they saw in Vietnam. And they are doing it. They did it in Iraq, they did it in Afghanistan, they are doing it here, and so on and so forth. So unfortunately, they are learning from their mistakes, but what the public is not. So I'm pessimistic about an opposition to the extent that we saw in Vietnam. For one thing, as what my colleague suggested, that there is no draft, and that was one of the lessons they learned. They brought reservists. So they send the children of working class and low-income family to the war, and who cares about them getting killed? In Vietnam, there were children, they had drafts, so there is no longer a draft. So there are the mass media, for example, the war in Iraq, was one of the most purified war ever waged because the imagery that was coming was not they were not showing children being blown up into pieces. You didn't see what you saw in Vietnam, that girl was running around and her skin was being peeled off, that bothers American conscious. You didn't see that in Iraq. So just what is called collateral damage, and so the media. I mean, there's a host of things that they have learned from that. Having said that, I still have faith and confidence in American public. So, and that's what I finished ended up my presentation by suggesting that there are Jewish organizations. There are basically just this past week, more than 867 professors from all over the United States signed signed a statement, which is beautifully written, condemning the state of Israel and demanding United States. These are over 800 professors, experts in the field, collectively signed demanding the United States withdraw its unilateral support from the state of Israel and call for ceasefire and come to the rescue of Palestine. So there are hopes, there are signs that are turning. Right now, unfortunately, I cannot tell the difference between CNN and Fox Network. Honestly, I can't. I cannot. I cannot tell the difference between CNN and Fox Network. But not that they are fundamentally different, but on this one, they are competing with each other. So there are hopes that even the several countries in the world have banned pro-Palestinian, including Germany, England. They have banned pro-Palestinian demonstrations, but thousands and thousands and thousands of people were in the streets this past weekend demanding ceasefire. So there are hopes in public opinion.
Okay, we have time for one last question.
It's not a question. I just want to thank you for the wonderful presentation and in the timeline of the events that has happened. I am proud to say that I'm American Palestinian descent from my parents that came in the 1930s or 1940. I'm asked, do you condone what happened? Of course I don't. No one condones the killing of any innocent civilians, whether it's Israeli or Palestinian, so that's a silly question. I'm saddened that When I say I'm a proud Muslim and a proud Palestinian, I'm compared to a terrorist, or I'm looked at as a terrorist. And I will continue to say I'm a proud American, Palestinian, and Muslim. And what has happened should not have happened. I am sad for the Israelis and the Palestinians that have to live in fear and in violence. You've given a wonderful presentation on the timeline, but I want to give you a little bit of how it is personally for me. I was born and raised in DC. My parents believed in instilling the Arab culture. We would go back to Palestine every year. I only knew it as Palestine, and I don't want to even say, Israel, except it is on the map, and that I do acknowledge Israel. We do believe in a two-state solution. I don't know, this is an interesting concept on the one-state solution. I do want to hear more about it. But I do believe in a two-state solution where there's borders and access to water and controlling owned water. When I go back to Palestine, I have water turned off every other day because it's controlled by the Israelis. And I just came back in July. In July, there were gunshots happening because Israelis were going into another refugee camp in Jenin. We don't hear about that here. We don't hear about the 5,500 Palestinian prisoners that have done nothing, but it's a form of genocide. That is what's happening. There was a slow form of genocide for 75 years, but it's been expedited right now, and an excuse to have it expedited in front of the entire world, and no one's saying anything, and no one can stop it. Half of Gaza, 2.2 million, the size of Delaware. Gaza is the size of Delaware. Delaware has 1 million people. Gaza has 2.2 million people. When I have to explain this to people, they ask me, well, why can't they leave? They can't leave. There's walls there. There's barbed wires. There's soldiers with guns. You do not have access to water. You don't have access to electricity. You cannot leave your area. There is checkpoints. I should be able to go from Ramallah to Jerusalem in 20 minutes, but it takes me 4 hours because of checkpoints. This did not happen October 7th. This resistance has been happening for 75 years. And lastly, I want to say, when my husband passed away 10 years ago, and he was born in Palestine and said, I want to die in Palestine, he goes through Tel Aviv because he's not recognized as a Palestinian. It was revoked from him. And I have to go through Jordan and hope that I can see him before he's buried. That is the situation that's happening. We need to solve this. Israelis cannot be continued to be killed. Jews should not be killed. Palestinians should not live in fear. No one should be living under occupation. A genocide should not be happening. And I'm hoping and I'm praying that there's a solution. Thank you for this wonderful presentation.
Thank you. I'd like to now bring this to a close. We're way over time. We would like to potentially continue this conversation and have subsequent panels that are discussing the situation as it's very fluid. But I'd like to thank you all for coming today. I'd like to give a round of applause for Dr. Daniel Borses and Dr. Dariush Haghighat. And if you'd like to come and talk to them, please feel free to do so. Thank you.
And also, I would like the students who sponsored this to stand up and to be acknowledged.
Yes, by all means. Political Science Student Association, please stand up. Thank you, everybody.